everyone. Welcome back to the American Aboriginals. Thank you so much for joining us today for another amazing presentation. We're super duper excited about this one because we have put a lot of work into this one in particular, and we are excited to share our research with you today. As you can see, it's called The Hidden Truths, Uncovering the Real Cause of the American Civil War. Now, I first want to just say again, thank you guys for being here today. And we are over 1,000 subscribers, so that really warms my heart. And again, thank you guys for your comments and all the great feedback you've been giving us. So again, let's just dive right in. I just want to introduce you guys to me. If you haven't been to the American Aboriginals before, and this is your first time, I'm Chris Robinson Jordan. I am the co-host of the American Aboriginals. And this is a bit of background about myself, and feel free to read it at your leisure, learn a little bit more about who is on the other end of the microphone. And as you can see, my heritage is pretty diverse as far as the American Aboriginals are concerned. My family is from North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia. And our heritage goes way, way back to Tuscarora, Sapani, Cherokee, and the Lumbee tribes. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in my family tree. But I want to do a summary of what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to start off talking about the American Civil War. I'll just do a quick overview of that and dive right into various shades of melanin. Then we'll be talking about white as a status, not a race. We'll also talk about the white slaves, which is what is not often talked about when we talk about the Civil War and the issue of slavery. And we'll also conclude with the quote unquote dark Confederates, or i.e. the Black Confederates of the United States, or I should say of the Confederate States of America. Okay, so let's dive into the American Civil War. Now, for many of us, we are familiar with the causes of the Civil War according to recorded and contemporary history, primarily being that of slavery, the issue of slavery. We also have the conflicts being about states' rights, where many of the Confederate states said, look, we want to do and run our states the way we want to and not according to what the federal government wants from us. There were also economic differences between the North and the South. The South was very much about farming and agriculture, and the North was moving more towards an industrial revolution. There also was the issue of territorial expansion. In other words, where was slavery going to be where was slavery going to be expanded into the territories? And of course, the failed compromises, i.e. the Missouri Compromise. So all of these are the complex reasons for why the American Civil War was fought. And again, it's so much to unpack here, but I want to really simplify this presentation today because I know that there's so much that's not being said, and I'm going to show you why. Now, let's first talk about who owned who. And I think this is so, so important because we don't talk enough about this. Now, you will see here Antoine Dubuclet, and he was actually he was one of the richest African Americans before the Civil War. And yes, he owned many slaves. He actually inherited them from his father in Louisiana. And he went on to run the plantation and buy more slaves. He also became a very prominent figure in politics in Louisiana and was the state treasurer of that state. So when you see most slave owners, you see white, quote unquote, white men. But I want to put his face up in particular because I want you to see what many of the slave owners looked like. And they were African, quote unquote, American. Now, to really get into this topic of who owned who, now look at this. We have slave owners who were quote unquote whites, free persons of color, Aboriginals or Indigenous or Indians, and the African. Like there were a few minority of African who were actually slave owners. So, but then when you look at the slaves were also whites, persons of color, Aboriginal, African. So That is not talked about very often in history, contemporary history. They'll say, oh, well, there weren't that many Black slave owners. There were only a small number. But I'm going to get into that too, because I'm going to dispel some myths today about who is quote unquote Black and who is white. But I just wanted to start off showing you this because we don't really talk about who owned who and how that played into not only the topic of slavery back then, but also how the war was actually triggered. So it was more than just about slavery. It was economic, as we know. Now, I want you guys to also, as we're talking about and thinking about this subject, I want you guys to really note these books and please, please read them because it's going to be very, very vital to having really cogent discussions around this. Read They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Please, please, please read Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, and also read White Cargo, The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America. So all of this is going to be really important for your erudition. Most of you guys know I'm a big proponent of reading books and not just looking at articles, because the books gives you so much more history and gives you so much more resources for you to continue to do deeper dives. And this is particularly important because when we talk about slavery, the issue of white slavery is kind of left out of the discussion because there's so much focus on the African slave. But if you don't talk about the white slave, you're going to miss a lot of dynamics that come into play here, right? So one of the biggest, I would say, important documents or books to read was compiled by Carter G. Woodson, who himself was his parents were slaves. So he had definitely a vested interest and deep interest in the issue of slavery because that's where he came from. He was also very, very educated. He had a PhD, and he was one of the first African Americans to obtain a PhD who also had parents who were slaves. So he's very, very educated, very, just incredibly smart. There's a whole video on him I can do. But one of the things he did was he compiled a list of the free Negro owners of slaves in the United States in 1830. And one of the things he found was that there were a total of 3,775 Black slaveholders in the South who owned a total of 12,760 slaves, right? So one of the things he found was that of those Black slaveholders, many of them were mixed race. Okay, I'm going to let that land for a minute. Many of the Black slaveholders in the South were mixed race in the year 1830. So when we talk about mixed race, that means they were descendants of someone, right? So that means that their parents were mixed race and their parents were mixed race. So yeah, we tend to think of things very monolithically sometimes, but think of those who came before. Now, in 1840, there was another book called A History of World Societies that documented a total of 6,000 Negro slave owners were in the U.S. So basically, a decade later, that number of Negro slave owners was increasing. And for instance, in 1850 in South Carolina, the census showed that 83% of the Negro masters were mulattoes, or basically mixed race people. And I'm just using the term mulattoes because that was the term they used back then. I know it's not one that they use now, right? So while nearly 83% of the Negro masters were mulattoes, nearly 90% of their slaves were of dark skin. Okay. So yes, note all of this. Now, in South Carolina in particular, what I find really, really fascinating was that of the 83% of the Negro masters, what we also had was of the slave population on the coastal areas, almost 80 to 90% of the people were enslaved. That is incredibly fascinating to me because what you're talking about is pretty much anyone who was living on the coastal area of South Carolina was a slave or enslaved, right? Really, really deep stuff. And I want to really drive that home because there's some points I'm going to be making later about that, right? Now, of course, I'm going to use my own family as an example. Now, the free families in the Confederacy, according to the census of 1860, almost 31% of the free families in the Confederacy owned slaves. It's a huge number, almost 31%. So that means that every third person in those states had a direct commitment to slavery. And here, this man on the left is Colonel Joseph H. Hyman, a Confederate, and he's my first cousin, 5 times removed. Yes, the Hymans of North Carolina, and they were very prominent. It was a very prominent family in North Carolina. They owned many slaves, inherited many slaves, and my third great grandmother is a Hyman, and her father was John Hyman. So that's the connection of the Hymans. But yes, when you look at the free families in the Confederacy, many of them across the board just had a vested interest in slavery, whether they were mixed race or whether they were quote unquote white. Now, as you can see, I don't know if you guys think that Colonel Hyman has a resemblance to myself, but he certainly isn't, I would say, clear cut, quote unquote, white man. His coloring tells you there's much more going on, correct? Right? Mm. So now that leads me to various shades of melanin and white as a status. Now, one of the things I'm going to note here is that when you think of the Aboriginal or the Indian, we know from research that there were various hues of Indian: red, brown, aka mulattoes on the US censuses. So Indians in general they were very, very diverse, very different coloring across the United States. Many Europeans were described in newspapers as being very swarthy. The African was often described as being dark or tawny. And in England in particular, most people in England, you could say that they were pale skinned or quote unquote white people, but they were very much in the minority. And I base this off of looking at newspapers and how people were described. So this whole concept of white and black, these are really, we didn't really start seeing those terms show up on the census until, it started showing up pretty early, but in terms of categorization and how people describe themselves, they didn't say, oh, I'm black and oh, I'm white. They were very specific about their family. Particularly if you were here in the US, you talked more about your tribal status if you were indigenous. So it was really about your family name, right? Okay. Now, here's something really interesting. Benjamin Franklin wrote an essay called Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, Peopling of Countries, etc. Now, as you know, Benjamin Franklin was a very prominent figure in the colonies. He was an essayist, he was a politician, he was so many different things. But I particularly note what he said here in his essay, quote, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe, the Spaniards, Italian, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. So yeah, you guys can read that twice if you'd like. But basically, this is a man, of course, who's well-traveled. We're talking about other observations that were made throughout the century of what people looked like, right? And so this is based on skin color. So again, we're talking about black or tawny, swarthy. In some cases, some people were also described as being ruddy, which is kind of a reddish color. So again, people all over the world were different shades of melanin, basically. And I want to show you something here. Now, this is Benjamin Franklin's mother, Abia Folger Franklin. Now, this painting of her was painted in 1707. 1707. And as you can see, she's clearly She's got a lot going on in her face. So she's not just quote unquote white. She's clearly a mixed race woman. And even that you can see the texture of her hair as well. Curly, all that jazz. Now, one of the books, again, I'm going to always be referring to books because I think when you guys start reading more and you start really doing deep dives on this research, you're going to be able to make a lot of distinctions and conclusions about what America looked like as opposed to the modern paintings that we see or the paintings that have been quite frankly whitewashed. And, people have been trying to alter the look of people. And that's a whole nother video in itself. But please read these books, The Negro Rulers of Scotland and the British Isles. Yes, Negro Rulers of Scotland and the British Isles. Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. And Nature Knows No Color Line. Many of you are familiar with these books. I will just say, reread them again. Sometimes I see new and different things when I reread the books, because again, the research is pretty extensive, and you can also do cross-referencing when you read these books. They're very, very important to understanding what the makeup of early America was, and not just what they keep telling us in these modern history books. Now, Jews and Muslims in British colonial America is particularly interesting. And I love this book, and it's my go-to for a lot of research because I'm looking up names. And the names are going to really tell you who's who and where people are from. Now, here's a quote that's really interesting that's in the foreword of the book. It says, quote, "Given an overweening Sephardic Jewish and Muslim presence in the American colonies prior to 1776, why that version of history was not the narrative promulgated to generations of Americans in their textbooks and public records." It's a really, really fair question. Why have we not been taught that there were a lot of Sephardic Jews and Muslims here in America, right? Because you're not just talking about culture and identity, you're also talking about how these individuals influenced America, right? So when you talk about a Sephardic Jew or Sephardic Muslim, you have to, of course, talk about coloring and talk about what they might have or did look like, correct? So I think it's really, really important that we pay attention to this, because yes, people were coming to America and they were escaping religious persecution. We know that. But they also came to America deliberately saying, we're not going to deal with the same thing that we were dealing over in Europe. We're going to start fresh and new. And we're just going to be crypto Jews and Muslims. We're going to practice our faith in private. We're going to keep it moving. But in that, there was also, I guess you can say, an admixture that we have to also be mindful of, that some of the people that were coming here also had the swarthy skin, the tawny skin, all of that. So again, there's a lot of passing going on. It has been going on for some time now, but pay attention to this book in particular, and let it be your go-to for really seeing who's who in this country. Now, I want to also share with you guys some things here, because again, we talk a great deal about the quote unquote white slave owner, but I want to up in some myths about what the white slave owner was about, and sometimes who they married and what their background really was. Now, here's a wedding photo of Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his young wife, Verona Howell Davis. And I also want to show you, again, clearly Verona Howell Davis is a mixed race woman. But of course, when you look at the census, she is white. That's her quote unquote race. That is what she was going by, right? So again, this is a man, right? This is the Confederate States of America, correct? And his wife is mixed race. But in his mind, she's white, right? So I just want to show you that visual. Some of you may be familiar with this photo, but I just wanted to show this because it's really interesting what we define as white and what a person clearly is. Of course, she doesn't look like she's the happiest bride in this photograph, but here it is. I also want to show you another photo of a mixed race woman by the name of Laura Spelman Rockefeller. And you would know her name because Spelman University, and she was also a substantial donor to Spelman College, right? And her husband, yes, was, yes, Rockefeller. So here you have it. You see her. She's another mixed race woman. And she is also listed as white in her census, the 1900 census. We also have more, I guess you could say, photos of well-known people that we know that clearly have a lot going on in their family tree. Dwight D. Ike Eisenhower. He's probably well known for being clearly I guess you can say, mixed race man. But he also doesn't look mixed race. As people get older, they start to look different. They start to look more. They don't look the same as their young photos, but the young photos are actually the giveaway. And as you can see in the middle, his skin is very dark. Here's another example, and these are actually Dwight D. Ike Eisenhower's parents, right? And you can see his mother is mixed race. Two different photos, but I just wanted to show you the contrast. Clearly has a lot going on as well. And here's another picture. This one is of Black Jack Bouvier, Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy's father. Yep, lots going on, right? And of course, we all know the infamous J. Edgar Hoover, who was very, very, very protective of his identity. And his Millie McGee, a relative of his, she wrote a book, J. Edgar Hoover, Passing for White. And it's a very detailed book of his ancestry. But as you can see, sometimes you can't hide it. It's like right there in front of you. But again, he passed for white. He was a white man, right? So all of this is important to understanding that you can be white in society, but your coloring and your face, your look, you've got a lot going on, right? Now I'm going to again use my family as an example. And sometimes the color line is not so clear, and sometimes it is. In the case of my 12th great grandmother, Catherine Cromwell Tommock, yes, the Cromwell. Clearly, she is my 12th great grandmother, and there's been a lot going on since 12 generations ago. But she's got my blood, and I've got her blood, and all that jazz. So there you have it. Here are a couple of my cousins, Dr. Mildred Robinson Wincoop. She's my first cousin, 2 times removed. And my father is James Brody Robinson. So that is where the Robinson names come from. And you can clearly see that, Dr. Wincoop, my cousin, she could have been passing for white, and she could have been a Negro woman, right, of the day. So depending on her look and depending on how she wanted to be, she could be either or. I'm not saying that she passed. There were times when clearly it noted that she was Negro on the census, but then she was also white on another census. And then there's my other cousin, William Oxidine, my first cousin. He could clearly pass, and sometimes he was listed as mulatto on a census, and other times he was white. So again, we go back to coloring and the choices that people make or don't make. And again, white isn't, as we are clearly seeing now, isn't necessarily representative of your culture, but more or less how you want to identify. So let's move on to white slaves. Again, I'm going to recap the Benjamin Franklin essay where he talks about the hues of different people. Again, swarthy, dark, tawny, and pale-skinned people. And of course, the Aboriginal Indian was red, brown, and everything in between. But when we start talking about the white slaves, as I guys have already showed you, white does not necessarily mean that you're white. It means you're just pale skinned, or as in the term of my grandmother, she would say light, bright, and damn near white. Right? So, but here's something I want you guys to be mindful of and note is there's another book that has uh, lot of great information in it regarding the white slave, if you will. And it's called The Forgotten Cause of the Civil War, A New Look at the Slavery Issue. And it was written by Lawrence Tinsor in 1997. Now, I want to point out something to you guys first before I dive into the book. I want you guys to first see how much this book is. It's out of print right now, but there's still a few copies floating around, right? And on Amazon, this book is currently $465. Very, very expensive book, right? And for most people, for those of us who do genealogy, we'll spend a good deal of money to get a rare book. we'll do that what we need to do to get the information if we can't find a printed book. But for those people who are interested in this, this history and this genealogy, may not be able to afford it. So I find it really interesting how they make these books really, really expensive to obtain. And here, there's different sellers, and they're selling it for different amounts. There's one, what's Books Unplugged, they're selling it for $870. So that's another way to keep the knowledge away from people, is to make these books very difficult to obtain. Again, you're seeing more prices here. And this price here on the right, literally, this book is almost $4,800. $4,800. That's insane to me. But the information in this book is pretty groundbreaking, and it just upends all of the talk about slavery that we've normally had. And I'll tell you why. Now, in the book, there are contents that get to the meat of what's going on in the book. For instance, what constitutes a mulatto. There's a section on white slaves. There's a section on racial theory of the pre-Civil War census. There's a section on the illicit slave trade and the new white slaves. So there's a lot of information in this book that really, again, upends this concept of slavery and this notion that all slaves are African. So one of the positions that Tensor writes about is the fear of slavery expansion. Now check this out. Northern whites feared that the institution of slavery, if unchecked, could expand beyond African Americans to include poor whites. I'm going to read that again. Northern whites feared that the institution of slavery, if unchecked, could expand beyond African Americans to include poor whites. The idea of white slavery served as a powerful symbol of the potential threat to their own freedom and economic security. Yeah, doesn't that change some things? So we're not just talking about the African slave. We're talking about poor whites being slaves. They were already enslaved before the Civil War broke out. A whole bunch of descendants of white slaves still working plantations, still working the fields, right? They weren't just all mixed race people, but then there were mixed race people who looked white, who were passing, who didn't want to be slaves anymore. Because remember, when the colonists started coming over to America, many people who were coming as indentured servants. So many of the people around the time of the Civil War they had done their service. They were done. They had raised their families, and they were now, quote unquote, free. So there's no way that they wanted to go back to being slaves again. No way. We've done that. We did our 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of slavery. Now my children are, quote unquote, free. We're good. But the idea of white slavery was just, no one wanted to think about that. But if you're passing, you're not going to admit that you are white. I mean, you're not going to admit that you are African, and you really don't want anybody to know that you are passing. Don't want anybody to know that. But you're not going to play into this notion too much of, oh my gosh, I'm going to support the Confederacy because the Confederacy is supporting slavery. So it was kind of like you're in this rock and a hard place. Hopefully I'm explaining that correctly, but you're kind of like in this rock and this hard place where you don't want to be a white slave. You don't want to be considered black, right? Because then you're a slave automatically. So you're in this interesting space of you don't want slavery at all if you have pale skin, right? So this pretty powerful stuff. Now check this out. This is going to be really interesting. And this is on the Library of Congress website. And as you guys know, I always share my sources. I'm a firm believer in sharing my sources. I'm not just talking and have an opinion. These are sources. So there was a document called the New Democratic Doctrine. And in that doctrine, it stated and said that slavery should not be confined to just the Negro race, but to be made the universal condition of the laboring classes of society. Yes. If you guys have an opportunity, please read this document. It's called the New Democratic Doctrine, right? So, of course, it was to ensure that we kept labor going, because if you don't have labor, you don't have an economy, right? Now, in the New Democratic Doctrine, the article from 1856 is a strongly worded critique of the Democratic Party's stance on slavery, particularly highlighting how some Democrats of that era began to justify the extension of slavery beyond blacks to include white laborers. Okay. Now, there was also support from the Southern newspapers. The article quotes Southern Democratic newspapers advocating the enslavement of white laborers and arguing that slavery is a natural, necessary condition for all laborers, irrespective of race. So here you have politicians in the elites saying that, oh no, we need to expand slavery. We need to ensure that we have enough labor. Now, keep in mind, the North had plenty of labor, but remember, there were no labor laws in place per se. There was no protections. You were just a worker and that was it. So in many cases, the Northern workers didn't really have any option but to continue working in certain conditions that they had there. But they were quote unquote free, supposedly, right? But now the Democratic doctrine is basically saying, yo, we're going to make everybody a slave. Because again, if we don't keep this labor going, we cannot continue our industrial revolution. We can't continue growing as a nation. Now, of course, there's so much to unpack about this particular doctrine. And, think about today. Don't we sometimes feel like we're slaves no matter what part of the country we're in? Yeah, that part. So also I want to note this other book called A Mulatto Slave, The Events in the Life of Peter Hunt. And again, when you see Peter Hunt, he looks very white, doesn't he? So this particular book talks about, Mr. Hunt's journey from being a slave to quote unquote being free. And he talks very vividly about his life. But again, he was a white, quote unquote, looking man who was a slave. And he was one of thousands, one of many, right? So I want to kind of do a deep dive into the quote unquote dark Confederates. And I did a kind of graph chart here for you guys to see that sometimes when you looked through Civil War records, you saw the complexions written down of various soldiers. Now, I was doing some research on one of my relatives, Enoch Latham, and came across this document here. So what you're seeing here is a list. This is just one of the lists. I'll get into more things later, of this list of men who fought in the Civil War and how they were described. So you see William S. Mitchell, he's 44, his eyes are blue, he has dark hair, and his complexion is dark. He was born in South Carolina. Again, there's Enoch Latham, born in Bibb County, 34, blue eyes, dark hair, dark complexion. Benjamin Tucker, 24, dark eyes, dark hair, dark complexion. So you're getting the point here that some of these men that were fighting in the Confederate Army were actually, they weren't quite pale, right? So, but I want you guys to understand the physical classifications of the term dark. Now, the term dark on Civil War records often referred to skin tone and appearance rather than strict racial identity. And this designation could include individuals of mixed race, such as those with African, Native American, or Creole ancestry. So, for instance, if you were standing in front of the guy who was writing up your information and he saw you, he was going to make a determination as to what you looked like. And in some cases, he might write dark, he might write fair, and I'll show you guys the actual documents I'm referring to. In the context of military records, dark might also describe someone who was not clearly identifiable as quote unquote white according to the racial norms of the era, but it did not necessarily equate them with being black or enslaved. It was more of a physical descriptor because, as you guys know, you could not, if you were quote unquote black or you were a former slave, you couldn't be in the armies. They didn't want black soldiers, they didn't want black men serving in the army. But I'm going to dispel that myth too a bit. In essence, being listed as dark in Civil War records typically indicated a person of mixed or ambiguous racial background. Now, again, as the war ramped up, they were more lax about, I guess you could say, someone's background. If you looked quote unquote dark, or maybe if you looked a little mulatto, no one freaked out. They just said, okay, sign you up. Sign you up because they needed men. And that's how that was. Now, again, here's the actual document that I'm referring to. And as you can see, many of the men have different physical descriptions from fair to dark, usually fair or dark. Right. And it tells you their occupation. It tells you where they were born, all of that stuff. Everything's handwritten, as you can see. Pretty fascinating stuff, isn't it? Now, again, I came across this when I was looking for my relative, and I noted the column complexion. And I said, what's going on there? Dark, dark, dark. What's that mean? And of course, I did some cross-referencing to see what the census said. And most of the time, it said that the particular soldier was white on the census. I want to say most of the time, sometimes I couldn't find the soldier on the census, but for the ones that I could, it usually said he was white. But yet, his complexion was quote unquote dark. Again, here's another muster roll of state militia, Alabama militia, Dallas County, Millhouse Company. Now, what's interesting here is I wanted you guys to note their occupations on this particular document, and notes their occupations: farmer, clerk, grinder, merchant, printer. Now, of course, when I was first fascinated by Civil War many, many years ago, I always wondered, well, why did white men who owned no slaves fight in the Civil War? That was always my thing. Across the board, yes, many of them were drafted. We know that. Many of them didn't want to fight. The draft kind of forced people to fight. But when you read some of the letters and you read some of the patriotism around the Confederacy, there were a lot of men who just were staunch advocates for saying, no, we're going to fight for our states' rights to own slaves. We're going to fight for our position in this society. And so as I'm doing deeper dives into this from a genealogical perspective, when I think about the white men who fought in the Civil War, they were probably also fighting for livelihood, right? Because when you look at these men, they had professions, farmers, clerks, grinders, they had quote unquote jobs. Now, we talk so much about corporate America and corporate greed, but here's the thing. If you were working for a slave owner, or you were working in industry in the South, you were working for, i.e., a corporation. You were working for a company. And so that company was tied to your livelihood, just like it is today. And so if slavery or if any aspect of that industry was upended, it also meant that so too was your livelihood. So I could understand why men who did not own slaves said, you know what, even though I don't own slaves, I still need this industry to work as it does because I have a job. I have a means to take care of myself and my family. Just like today, if, for instance, some big, large corporation, I don't know, went out of business, it would affect everybody. Like, we've seen the triggers of when a big company goes under or when a big company loses, half of its stock, value. It really does affect the economy in a very, very large way. And therefore, those families are unemployed. Those families, can't eat, can't live, can't survive. So we can talk all day about slavery in the context of, oh, it was a cruel, cruel industry. And it was, but it also was employing a lot of people, just like today, where we have corporations that are doing egregious things overseas and domestically, and yet people still rely on them for their livelihoods and for their survival. So I just wanted to put a little bit of a modern context to things so that we understand what we're dealing with and understand why some of these men fought in the war, even though they were not slave owners themselves. Okay. Again, we see more names of men: printer, laborer, student, shoemaker, all of that. Mm-hmm. And here's the original document that I sourced this information from. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Now, all things, right? So we have, and the other question I have is, okay, we have all these Black slave owners, mulattoes, what have you, that are slave owners. But did anyone think to ask, how did the free Black slave owners feel about the Confederacy? Did they consider themselves to be Black Confederates? Now, there are those who argue that there were no such thing as Black Confederates. And I will counter that and say, I don't know how that could not be if you had Black slave owners who had a very, very much vested interest in this economy because their wealth was tied to it as well. So again, I've already showed you guys that being white was not necessarily about your skin color. It was about status. And that the free Black slave owners also were owning slaves alongside the so-called white slave owners. But we know that some of those white slave owners were not really white. They were probably mixed race and descendants of those mixed race who had been coming from Europe, et cetera, right? But the question, it still begs the question, right? So take case in point, the first Louisiana Native Guard, as we know, they were Confederates. Now, this particular photo is published in the Visual Dictionary of the Civil War on page 16. It is described as photograph of first Louisiana Native Guard member, and it's from the private collection of Dr. Keith Kengalozi. Hopefully I'm saying his name correctly. The Confederate Memorial Hall, and this is in New Orleans. Now, as you can see, this particular Confederate soldier, he was not identified in this particular source, but you can clearly see that he is mixed race, mulatto. He's got a lot going on in his face. But he was a member of the first Louisiana Native Guard. And I could do a whole video, and I probably will, on the Louisiana Native Guard, right? And they were mixed race people who were free, who decided to support the Confederacy. Now, the first Louisiana Native Guard was originally formed by the Confederate Army in 1861, shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War. The Confederate state militia in Louisiana authorized the enlistment of free men of color, primarily Creoles of mixed French, Spanish, and African descent, to form this regiment. Right? This was an unusual and largely symbolic gesture by the Confederacy, which typically opposed arming Black soldiers. So, keeping in mind, without going into a lot of detail, because again, this is very, very huge to unpack, you had mixed race people who were free, who were very much about keeping their land, keeping their wealth, maintaining everything that they had built and worked so hard for. So supporting the Confederacy was not even an issue, right? It wasn't something that they had to think deeply about at all. And if you are already, quote unquote, looking white, right? Because he clearly looks white, doesn't he? Then you were already a member of the slaveholding class. And that was that. There we go. So again, here's another picture of the Louisiana Native Guards. But what's really fascinating about the Louisiana Native Guards is that when the Union Army took over New Orleans in 1862, these same men, the Louisiana Native Guards, then they became supporters of the Union. They then became Native Guards for the Union side, right? Isn't that fascinating? They then went from supporting the Confederacy to now supporting the Union. But really, they didn't have any choice because the Union had taken over New Orleans. So you are either going to support or not. And you know what that means if you don't support. You either go to the gallows or, there's no option. You really didn't have an option. Now, the thing about why the free Blacks joined the Louisiana militia was a variety of reasons. And in this particular book, The Louisiana Native Guards, the Black Military Experience During the Civil War, Charles Gibbons was a free Black house painter. He testified after the war that he had entered the Confederate service fearing for his life. Pure and simple, just like I had mentioned. I either do it or I don't. And other free Blacks had volunteered from fear of losing their property. So basically, you're living in Louisiana, Texas, not necessarily Texas, but Louisiana, Georgia, whatever Confederate state you're living in. And you're like thinking to yourself, well, how do I protect my family? Who's going to protect my family? So I don't have a choice but to join the Confederacy and become a quote unquote Black Confederate. I have to live. Now, keep in mind, this was the free Blacks. We're not talking about those who were enslaved, who were basically told that they had to fight or be attendants to their slave master and all of that jazz. Again, this is like a whole nother video I'll have to do because there's a deep, deep dive on that as well, right? Another reason why free Blacks joined the Louisiana militia was economic self-interest. Like I mentioned before, they had to protect their interests. Now, representatives of the free Black community in New Orleans were both prosperous and well educated. And why I use New Orleans as an example is because New Orleans is, I guess you could say the southern version of New York. It was a very, very diverse city. It was very progressive in the terms of southern cities. Now, the free people of color enjoyed privileges not afforded to Blacks elsewhere in the South, allowing them by 1860 to accumulate more than $2 million worth of property. It's a lot of property. I didn't do a comparison to how much $2 million is worth in today's dollars, but I'm pretty sure it's up there. It's probably, I don't know, 100 million or something to that effect. I have to check. So now, more than 80% of the free Black population in New Orleans in 1860 had European blood, which goes back to the colonists. The colonists were European. The colonists were mixed race people, right? Because of skin color and free status were highly correlated, many free Blacks identified more closely with Southern whites than with African Blacks. Yet, all that being said, the Confederate authorities never intended to use Black troops for any mission of real importance. Now, I also want to say this too, that we talk a great deal about the Confederacy and even the Union, for that matter, not wanting to enlist Black troops. Now, I want to give you guys the why of it, because sometimes it's so easy. Oh, they didn't want us because we were Black. Well, no, there's some very specific reasons why. Because they didn't know if we were loyal. Who were we really loyal to, right? If you're a free Black person in the South and you're once supporting the Confederacy, and now the Union is taken over, and now you say, oh, well, I'll fight for the Union. Can you really trust that person? And this is in the context of Louisiana, I speak of specifically, but even when you think about Blacks across the board who wanted to fight and wanted to defend slavery, what do you do with them? Right? Because we're talking about the descendants of these slave owners who've been slave owners for years, for decades. Now, all of a sudden, they're going to fight against slavery. Even if you were living in the North and you didn't like slavery, you were still benefiting from it. And some of the families never were going to really tell you how they were really getting their money, or they weren't going to really share with you their true feelings, because their wealth and their stature was tied to their families. Because remember, many of the families, all the families didn't go down south. Some families went up north who had owned slaves. They had set their slaves free, but they were now living a different life. So just want to put that out there. So in summary, because we're almost in the near of this, guys, Benjamin Franklin's 1751 essay asserts that only a small proportion of the world was white. White is a status, not a cultural identity. Many mixed race, high profile people passed for white, as I showed you earlier. The lineage of numerous families in the colonies traced back to Jewish and Muslim roots. And again, I'm adding this here. Many indigenous tribes intermarried with other tribes, Europeans, and Africans. So there you have it, you guys. I know it's a lot to unpack here, but what I'm basically saying is that we're all mixed race. We're all mixed race. And this black and white argument regarding the Civil War is very simplified, I think, and it keeps people divided. When we really start to unpack what was going on, it was complex, but at the same time very simple. People just were not going to talk a great deal about their origins. They were going to live their lives, and they were going to keep accumulating their wealth, however they were going to accumulate their wealth. And I've also shared with you guys that I think I shared with you guys this too, that some of the slave owners owned their own families. So it wasn't just I'm owning someone that I don't know, I'm also owning my family member. Right. So yes. So you guys, thank you again for just hanging in there and really sticking through this particular presentation. I know there was a lot to unpack, but it was so important to get this particular video out. I felt, particularly now, as so many questions, this whole question of who's black and who's white. It's a lot more complex than that, but it's also very simple at the same time. We're all mixed race. We all have a whole bunch going on. Now it's time to just, be real with it and identify with who we are, and stop hiding under the guise of, oh, I'm white, or, oh, I'm black, because you're much more than that. And your origins. Your origins. So in any case, I welcome all of your comments. I welcome your feedback. I do listen to your feedback. And sometimes that feedback that you give me, whether it's positive or negative, is also a fuel for future videos and gives me so many great ideas. Again, thank you guys for being here. Keep liking and subscribing. We are so happy that you're here and so happy that you're part of this journey with us. Talk to you guys later.